Hi, welcome. Welcome to our home here at Through the Looking Glass. Is this a little too loud? Too loud. Better?
Yeah.
Yes, it took us 15 years to get into this building, and my hair was not white before I started this part. I'm going to talk to you about young adult children. This is the first large-scale national study of young adult children of disabled parents. So I'm going to kind of give you a little background. I'm the principal investigator along with my colleague Jean Jacob. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on how and why we did this study. I'm going to focus for the rest of the morning on the adult children of parents with psychiatric disabilities, but I want to give you a background on the whole study. So in 2005, we started a scholarship program at Through the Looking Glass. We started with 5 $1,000 scholarships for students who had a parent with a disability. And we didn't define what disability meant. We just said that it was either some type of disability or a serious medical condition that lasted at least a year. We also gave other examples of people who were deaf, who were blind, who maybe didn't refer to themselves as disabled. We kind of wanted to throw it open. So the first year we got 75 students who applied from about 10 or 12 states. The second year, 200 students. And by the third year, we had 500 students from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. At the time, we had about 40 different parental disabilities represented, including parents with psychiatric disabilities. What was in the application? Well, in the application there was a standard, tell us about your family, your address, how many people in your family. We asked them for a letter of recommendation. We asked them for school transcripts. And we asked them to write a 2 to 3 page essay on the experience or the impact of having a parent with a disability. And I'd like to read you one piece from an essay. Thank you for asking me about my life growing up with a parent with a disability. I think this is the first time someone has ever asked me what it was like. Everybody else always makes assumptions, all sorts of assumptions, like it must have been really terrible or weird, but they never really ask me. All these people just look at me and my family, and they think they know. I'd like to tell you myself. And that's the kind of thing we heard over and over from students. We also heard that they would tell us they didn't know anybody else who had a parent with a disability. We started hearing from teachers and counselors at schools who got the announcement about these scholarships and said, you know, I never realized there were any students in my school who had a parent with a disability. So we started thinking about it, and we thought that we had an enormous amount of potential material, but it was not yet a research study. So we applied to the U.S. Department of Education, and we got funded first for a 3-year and expanded to an 8-year study, a national study on young adults 17 to 21 who had a parent with a disability. Now, there's a couple things to note about this study. One is that this is for high school seniors who are going on to college or already in college. So this is a somewhat special group. These are students who are succeeding, who are doing well. But one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to address this problem. And the problem is that there's a lot of assumptions by people in the general public, in the literature, that if you have a parent with a disability, the child is going to have serious negative outcomes. And that bias really affects the stability of these families. Now, Through the Looking Glass, we receive over 5,000 contacts a year regarding a parent in a custody situation, someone who's trying to take away their child. One of the things that gets asked by the courts, by judges, by lawyers is, if we leave that child with the parent, how do we know that child is going to turn out okay? Now, that's not a very fair question. How can you ever answer that question about any parent? Nevertheless, it gets asked. So we wanted to provide some documentation for at least some children of parents with disabilities. How do they turn out? So these were our research goals. One, and because I'm an anthropologist, and I think we've been hearing this over and over at the conference, we wanted these young adults to be able to talk for themselves, to tell us what they feel, what they experience, to interpret their experience, not have somebody tell them what their experience meant. The other was to look at what factors contributed to positive or negative outcomes. There's a lot of studies that focus just on negative outcomes. And not only do they focus on negative outcomes, they don't tell us, well, what could have prevented those negative outcomes? So we wanted to look at the whole range of options. These were some of our research questions. We wanted to know, because this was a cross-disability study, do different parental disabilities affect outcomes for their children? What are the strengths and what are the challenges of having a parent with a disability? And what factors contributed to positive or negative outcomes? So these were our data sources. We used our scholarship project, scholarship application. And I want to say, when students applied for our scholarships beginning in 2010, and it's going to go all the way through 2016, when they apply for our scholarships, they can volunteer to be a participant in our research study or not. Their willingness to participate in the study does not affect their scholarship chances. And over the years, we find about half the students volunteer to take our survey, the other half do not. Among the winners, and we're now up to 15 winners a year that we're able to offer scholarships to, about half have taken the survey, half have not. So we think that's a pretty good indication of the spread. Besides the essay, we developed a 55-item online survey that includes all sorts of things about the student. Do they have siblings? How old are they? About the parent, what type of disability they have, when did it begin, before the student was born, what age, if it was after they were born, how much do they help their parent, who do they talk to about their parent, do they have another parent who also has a disability, and a lot of other questions. We also built in 2 standardized measures that we wanted to tie this to the general population. So one is a measure of self-esteem, and one is a measure of perceived stigma. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little later. So I'm going to go real quickly through this. So right now, and this is the other thing to keep in mind, this is a preliminary report. We can report on what we've been finding so far. We still have a few more years to go, but this is kind of an indication. So far we have about 1,700 students who participated. This was as of 2012. About 1,700 students who participated. About 11% of them are who have a parent with a disability. Yeah.
What was your definition of disability altogether?
We left it wide open, and we said that it could be a parent who had at least a year of had a disability, a serious disability or medical condition that lasted at least a year, but you may also not use a term like disability. You may use other terms that we gave. But we sort of expanded the list. It was almost a page of, it's kind of a little burdensome, but it was, we really wanted to keep it open. And right now we have about 110 different disabilities that are represented. Yeah?
Are they in California?
No, this is U.S. This
Okay.
is all over the U.S. All 50 states and the District of Columbia. So just real quickly, about 72% female, and we have more exact statistics, but I don't want to get bogged down in the minutia. But roughly 72% were female, 28% male. You can see the breakdown in terms of the women who had mothers with disabilities, the women who had fathers with disabilities, the men who had fathers with disabilities, and men who had mothers with disabilities. The other important thing about this is, right now I'm going to report only on the students who identified their primary parent had a psychiatric disability. They may have had another parent who had a psychiatric or other type of disability. We're not going to go into that right now. We're still analyzing that. Also, in terms of our ethnic and racial breakdown, you can kind of see that. We still have a pretty high rate, 75% white Caucasian. We are reaching out to a number of other traditional black colleges, churches, and we're trying to build up those numbers. Yeah?
Are there more women willing
to be in study, or are there more than
It runs about equal, so it's about 50% of the, this is both of the scholarship applicants are also more women than men applying for scholarships. So this is about the same percentages. So this is a breakdown of those with parental psychiatric disabilities. And this is the kind of breakdown. You can kind of see, and I won't go through the whole thing, you can see that the majority are bipolar, schizophrenia, and depression. You know, this is not necessarily representative of the general population. It would be higher depression or anxiety, but this is nevertheless who we have. Now, one thing that we have not done yet is we don't have sufficient numbers to break this down in terms of outcomes. So does it matter if the parent has a bipolar disorder versus OCD versus dissociative identity? We will get to that hopefully by the time we finish our study, because we think we'll have sufficient numbers. But right now, this is all sort of collapsed into one big category. Yeah.
Were you surprised by these numbers? Because I had a look at it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and you know, you could. I will say that we keep the scholarship reviewers separate from the researchers. So the scholarship reviewers are a whole set of other people who are reading through the essays, and they will tell, you know, I hear over and over and over that the most poignant, the most striking essays come from the students who have parental psychiatric disabilities. They will tell me that over and over. And I think there's a lot of studies that talk about creativity that comes out of, and you can kind of see it in the essays. The other thing I want to say is that one of the unique things about this study is that we tried to combine both qualitative and quantitative methods. So we used quantitative methods for this survey, we used qualitative analysis for our essays. And I want to read.
Why were you surprised by that numbers?
Because I work for a mental health agency and a children's mental health agency, and I'll be honest, the majority of kinds of mental health challenges we're working with are really anxiety. So when I look at OCD and anxiety represented as only 5%, and the majority of it would have a bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia is much smaller. So what I'm thinking is, I'm anticipating that perhaps children who grow up with a parent who have anxiety or OCD don't really perceive it as a disability. That either those parents are coping fairly well and they're not identifying as a disability because maybe at this point the study being done, their parents have had CBT and they're managing quite well and functioning well in their lives, and they're not identifying as a disability. But this is probably 80% of the work that we do. So it's much rarer to be working. Now, I will also add one thing. In the States, there's, no offense, but there's a bit more of a tendency to diagnose bipolar for children. We don't diagnose bipolar for children, although these are young adults, right?
Right, these are
Okay.
17 to 21.
So, but we don't diagnose bipolar for children, and we don't really see that. So schizophrenia is sort of an age of onset at 18 plus. But I'm just surprised because when I saw that 3 and 2%, because in terms of the representation by the population, I would expect that would have been much higher. But it tells me something about how kids are viewing the anxiety.
Yeah,
Real quick.
yeah, and I'd just like to mirror that as well, where youth workers from Australia, and same thing, anxiety, depression, are way up there in terms of statistics, way bigger than bipolar. But you know, I'd get the same feeling from that, is that, you know, they'd sort of just, you know, learn to live with it and deal with it, in terms of, you know, what you'd see as being living with, you know, somebody with bipolar.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, this is what we researchers would call a sample of convenience. So it's who comes to us, and you know, we realize that that's one of the limitations. But on the other hand, and as I think you'll see when I talked about mixed methods, I want to read you a quote from another essay, because part of the richness to me of the data is that these are articulate and candid young adults who tell us what's going on in their life. All children are born with the image of what their father is supposed to be, that of a supportive and loving parent. Mine was that image, but he was also the monster of my nightmares. My father was diagnosed with bipolar disorder before I was born. It's difficult to describe what it's like growing up with someone who has a mental illness. My father once described his manic episodes as a train that was speeding on the tracks with no brakes. His brain keeps going and going, but he can't stop himself. One day he'll be talking a mile a minute and hearing voices, and then the next he would sink into a deep depression and seclude himself from the world. So one of the things on our survey, we wanted students to basically rate their overall experience. How would you describe, how would you rate your experience? We actually had a 5-point Likert scale from very negative, negative, mixed, positive, very positive. In our analysis, we collapsed the negative and very negative and the positive and very positive. So you basically see 3 categories here. In the overall sample, 58% described their experience as positive, 35% mixed, and 7% negative. For the parent, those who had parents without psychiatric disabilities, 62% positive, 32% mixed, and 6% negative. For those whose parents had psychiatric disabilities, you can see a much less positive 32%, 46% mixed, and 22% negative. One of the things we wanted to do was to try to unpack this, to see, well, so what factors contributed to these differences? Why was it positive, negative for certain students? So we wanted to, one of the things we wanted to look at, because there's some suggestions in other studies that the course of the parent's disability, whether it became better, became worse, was sometimes better, sometimes worse, or was it stable? So this was the breakdown of those whose parents had psychiatric disabilities. 48% said it was sometimes better, sometimes worse. 44% said it became worse, 5% said it became better, and 4% said it was stable. Yes?
When you say parents without psychiatric disabilities, do you mean parents with other kinds of disabilities or parents with
Yes,
disabilities?
parents with other types of disabilities.
Uh-huh.
So this is the breakdown of these students. So now we're going to look at how does this compare with the experience. So of the 48% who said sometimes better, sometimes worse, 12% rated their experience as negative, 59% mixed, 29% positive. Of the 44% who were saying worse, it was almost evenly split across the 3 groups, 36% negative, 33% mixed, and 31% positive. Now you're going to be disappointed with the next 2 because our sample sizes were too small to really project this, but we do feel by the end of the study we'll be able to figure that out.
That says something. That tells you something.
Yes. We wanted to look at self-esteem. Now self-esteem, there's a measure by Rosenberg. It's a very standard. It's used in a lot of studies almost for the last 50 years. So we wanted to use something that other people had used and compare how that goes. Now, in other studies, not done by us, other studies, and there are hundreds of studies on young adults, high school students, college students, the average mean score and the highest score that you could possibly get for self-esteem, and you had super high self-esteem. I don't know that anybody has that high self-esteem, but anyway, high self-esteem is 40, so that's the high score. The average for young adults of this age group who did not have parents with disabilities or they weren't identified is 30.2 to 34.4. In our study, the whole sample, this is the whole sample of all students with parents of all different types of disabilities. The mean score was 34, which is almost at the very high end of the national sample. Now, of those whose parents had psychiatric disabilities, 32.72, so that's still well within the range. So I think that's one indication that, you know, the self-esteem of a lot of these kids is not bad at all.
You're selecting a group that has sent you essays for scholarship versus a more normal distribution in the population. For example, I work with as a child psychiatrist in Richmond, which is an extremely poor community, I don't know, describes like Berkeley, Oakland Square. I mean, how can you compare those?
These are college students. These are Princeton students.
I see.
These are college, high school and college students. So these are not, I mean, we deliberately looked at those studies that were more matched with our study. But you're right. And again, you know, it's an example of convenience. This is what we have. But yeah, we were very careful to look at a more rarefied group like that. We wanted to ask, and we gave students a whole list, both we piloted this, we did focus groups. We gave them a whole list, longer than this, of what were the advantages of having a parent with a disability. This is the rating in order for those whose parents have psychiatric disabilities. This is the overall sample. You can kind of read this, and you have it on your hand notes, but most of these are fairly comparable with a couple of exceptions. Being resilient was much more frequently identified among those with parental psychiatric disabilities than those with parents with other types of disabilities. Conversely, being tolerant of others was much less frequently identified, and having more time with my parents was much less frequently, significantly less. Yeah?
Can you tell me what that means? They were more
They
likely
were
to-
able, because of their parents' disability, yeah, this is kind of a shorthand.
Yeah.
Because of their parents' disability, they could spend more time with that parent. And I think the easiest example is if a parent had some sort of physical disability, was staying at home, couldn't go out as much, that also meant they could spend more time. If they were confined to home. And those are some of the examples that students gave us.
And the tolerance one.
Being more tolerant of other people.
So the high school, college students who have parents with psychiatric disabilities are a
Reported
little bit more
they reported that they were less
frustrated
tolerant
people.
Less tolerant than
than those with all the other the whole group.
Okay.
But that concerns normal other people, not psychiatric other people. Because in literature, there is some tendency to say that these children are more tolerant for people with handicaps.
Yes, so it's still half. You gotta look at it that way. It's still half, but it is lower than those with the whole group. So again, and we're still looking at some of the factors. We have like a laundry list of factors that we were looking to see. Why is this? Is it different for certain types of psychiatric disability? We're still looking at that. So we wanted to flip this around and find out what were the disadvantages of having a parent with a disability. And this was by far the biggest response among all groups, and including those with parental psychiatric disability. So 79% said they had limited finances, and that was the biggest negative impact, biggest challenge of having it. And I think that's not surprising. Not getting to do as many things with my parent. Being embarrassed. Now you'll notice that this group of those with parental psychiatric disability had a much higher report of being embarrassed than the students who had other types of disability, or the overall sample. Too many responsibilities, a little more among this group. Being isolated, again, a significant difference in this group, and I think that's what you might expect. Negative attitude, being vulnerable, not enough time for myself, being discriminated. Those were sort of more with, not significantly different.
How did you get those topics?
We did focus groups, we did piloting with other young adults, we used the literature, and we also used our 30 years of clinical intervention work, and we just ran a bunch of things over and over to see. And these are not the only ones that appeared, but this was the top ones that came out.
In terms of the numbers, the overall has the psychiatric folded into that, or
Yes.
And what the percentage mean? What does percentage mean? Is that the percentage of
The
people
percentage
who
who
have- yes?
responded that this was, 79% said this was a disadvantage.
Okay.
So, then we wanted to look at stigma, and I'm going to read another quote. "We never talked about his disability. My mother only told me about it because he told us we never existed. That he was leaving us because he had cyberplaned into another dimension, and unmarried my mother. So all of this wasn't real anymore. I was in the 7th grade, and I had no idea what schizophrenia even was. So we wanted to look at stigma, and we wanted to somehow anchor it, because there's a lot of things that we can talk about qualitatively, and I'll talk about that a little later. But in terms of stigma, we developed a scale. It was based on Link, who did he did a 10-point scale, or 10-question scale on perceived stigma. That is, how do you think other people perceive people like that still on? Still on. Well, I guess that didn't like the stigma, huh? So how do you think other people perceive people like yourself? Now, Link did it on people who themselves had mental illness. There was another study that adapted Link, Gershon, and she did it on young adults whose mothers were lesbian. So we kind of tweaked that and asked, well, how do you think other people feel about people who have parents like yourself? So the overall sample, the mean stigma was 26. Now the low, 10 was a very low, meaning almost no stigma. 40 was very high, meaning a lot of stigma. In Link's group, the scores ranged from in the high 30s. In Gershon's group, those young adults with lesbian mothers, it was about 34. So this isn't too bad, but the stigma score for those whose parents had other than psychiatric disabilities was 26. The stigma for those whose parents had psychiatric disabilities was 33, and that was significantly higher, So these are some of the problematic outcomes that we've kind of identified so far. We've talked about some of them. Unstable or parental disabilities, it got worse. This is true for both those who had psychiatric disabilities as well as other types of disabilities. The interesting question that when we asked students, how much time does your family spend socializing with people without disabilities? A little, a lot, not at all. How much time does your family spend socializing with people with disabilities? Little, not a lot, you know. Well, the interesting thing is that those whose families socialize with other people, others with disabilities, they had much less negative outcomes. The negative outcomes could be more positive overall experience, higher self-esteem, less stigma. So this was an interesting finding to us so far. And then, as you might expect, we asked them, how does your community, your local community, perceive your family? Again, positive, negative, gave them a wide range of choices. The more negatively their family was perceived in their community, the more likely they were to have negative overall experience, lower self-esteem, higher degree of stigma. So I'm going to sort of wrap up by sort of switching gears and going to our qualitative analysis. So as we're doing our qualitative analysis, we have kind of, separate from the survey, we've come across 4 major themes in what students wrote and talked about. We've talked a little bit about the first 3, and I'll talk a little bit about the last one. So the first one I'm going to read about life skills. And just about every student touched on this issue. Living with my mother hasn't just been a sob story, though. It's also made me a better person. I learned a lot of things at a young age that other kids my age still haven't learned. I learned responsibility and courage. I learned how to budget money for food and necessary household items, how to cook and clean properly, how to care for others who can't care for themselves. I'm tougher, better able to deal with problems, and definitely wiser about the world around me. Now this is sort of a positive spin. We also heard stories like this. At a young age, I was forced to learn independence. Although I appreciate that skill now, I'm proud to say that I don't have to rely on others. However, it was forced on me. With my parents not being able to do things other parents could, I had no choice but to grow up quickly than most, required to take on bigger responsibilities. I had no teen years. I often feel as if I lost my chance to just be a kid, enjoy school, and have fun. Now, we didn't hear this as often, but we did hear this. And the thing I want to underscore is there's sort of a dual nature here, that even though this person and others talked about growing up too fast, maybe losing some of their childhood, they also talked about the value they saw in it. And I don't want to, I feel like it's dishonest to sort of pull that away from them and say, well, you know, it was all negative. You didn't really have that great a time. So I think it's important to keep that perspective. Stigma and difference. This was another theme that kept coming up. You can't see my mother's disability. It's hidden. You won't use this, huh? I think it's telling me something. You can't see my mother's disability. It's hidden in secret. If you were my you can't see my mother's disability. It's hidden in secret. If you were my professor or my friend and I told you about it, I'm afraid you might either back away or feel awkward around me. I'm afraid it would change your view of me, not just your view of my mother. I'm afraid that my mother's disability will make people think that I'm sick or different. My mother and I were always afraid in some way. So one of the things that we saw in the students talking and writing about being stigmatized or being different is it seemed to sort of go one of two ways. Either, like this woman is talking about, kind of internalize a sense of shame and difference, or you sort of flip it around as this student talks about it. I've accompanied my father to a psychiatrist on numerous occasions. Unfortunately, our society still possesses a negative stigma about visiting a shrink. At first, I would be too embarrassed to join my father in one of his sessions. I was too scared of other opinions. These initial sentiments have served another purpose. Since I didn't want people to judge me, I try not to bestow preemptive evaluations upon others. I've become more accepting of ideas deemed unconventional, because I know that a book truly shouldn't be judged by its cover. So it sort of then becomes the valuing of being different, the valuing of being special. Another theme was the financial impact. I'm not going to read this one. You can kind of read it. It's on your handouts. But again, a lot of them not only talked and pointed out in our survey, but they wrote about the financial impact. And they wrote about it in these ways. First of all, 55% of these students who had parents with psychiatric disabilities, 55% have family incomes of less than $40,000. Now, in the United States, the median income is around $51,000. 22% had household incomes of less than $15,000. Now, that's well below the poverty line. They wrote about and talked about their parents' unemployment, underemployment, and the job insecurity, instability. They wrote about uninsured medical, pharmacy, and hospital costs. And I think that, for these people for other people to understand what the financial impact, I mean, you can say there was financial impact, financial challenge, but to really hear what that was and hear it articulated, I think gives you a much better picture. They talked, some of the students, and particularly those who had parents with bipolar, talked about binge shopping and unnecessary purchases. But finally, the theme that sort of stood out among all themes and had the highest degree of correlation with positive outcomes was the nature of the parent-child relationship. I'm going to read these last couple and then I think we'll stop. My mother's brain hurts her, but my mother's heart has made us a family. Even if her outside is a mask she puts on for other people, I can see through it. I can see past the inside where her brain is misfiring and in turmoil. I can see past her disability to my real mother and her loving heart. While we both live in different kinds of fear, we also live with hope. I'm slowly learning how to make friends, learning how to stand up for myself without fear, and learning how to change policies, law, and economic opportunities for people like my mother. Another quote. Though I have memories of the bad times, I also have memories of the good. My father is a gifted musician from whom I inherited my musical talents. I remember sitting on his lap as a toddler, plunking piano keys while he played around me. My life has been a journey of understanding when it comes to my dad. I know that his behavior is not his fault, but simply the imbalance of chemicals in his brain. Even though it's difficult to put aside my hurt and anger, I accept my father for who he is. From my father's illness, I also took away compassion, courage, and above all, the knowledge of how to survive at all costs. I cannot deny that there's something flawed in my case as a typical father, but instead I choose to see him as the man he can be, rather than the man he is on those bad days. And again, the more informed and the more positive relationship that these young adults describe their relationship with their parents, that seems to correlate very strongly with how they rated their overall experience, the higher degree of self-esteem, and a lower degree of stigma. Those, and it's interesting in reading, and I don't give you examples here, but if a parent felt strongly stigmatized, like somebody would write, my mother never lets anybody come into the house, and I feel the same way, I'm embarrassed. So the stigma kind of gets passed along from parent to child. And the last thing I want to leave you with, especially for those out in the field and working in the field, is this quote. Now at the age of 17, I know that I was the true source of my own fear, low self-esteem, and self-isolation. Being so young and impressionable, I didn't know how to ignore or stop worrying about what other people said about me. I didn't know how to stand up for myself if I was confronted as being the child of a disabled parent. I didn't know how to explain what I was going through. No one explained it to me, so I felt like I was alone when dealing with my family situation. So I think the idea of being able to talk about it in the family, having other people connect and encourage, it sort of goes back to the very beginning where no one has ever asked me, not just parents with psychiatric disabilities, but a lot of kids whose parents had a number of other serious, significant health conditions, terminal health conditions, but again, nobody ever talked about it. I mean, it's a very similar pattern, and those are the kids who seem to be struggling the most. So now I'm going to have a couple minutes for questions, I guess. 5 minutes? Yeah.
It's actually more of a question or a comment than a question, but I noticed in the first two examples, both young people talked about like understanding it from like a medical perspective, and then this last one, how it's like nobody told them about it. So I see like two things that ties to the literature, and that they found that kids that tend to see it as like it's not their fault, that it's due to like physical illness, that they seem to adapt better. And then also this kid shows the understanding. So I really think this kind of just highlights what the research says.
One of the other groups that we got a lot of participation from, because they are one of the biggest organizations, disability organizations in the United States, is the National MS Foundation. So we're on their circuit. So we have a lot of kids whose parents have MS involved in this. And that group is interesting because you can just see how educated they are about their parents' disability, how much they know what's happening. It's a remarkable testament. I mean, they're giving medical explanations of what's going on with their. I mean, they really know what's happening, and they will say, "That's what made the difference to me." And if we can repeat that kind of thing in other arenas. Yeah.
Is there a plan to break down the way that you broke down about the parents' course of treatment? I think it would be helpful to break it down based on poverty and income.
Yes. We
in terms of the patient, the kid's perception.
Yeah. We're sort of, as it were, swimming in data and data analysis, but we're very gratified at the response we've gotten. The problem is that we really are literally swimming in data and trying to, and again, it sort of challenges your hypothesis. Well, you think that this may be related to that, and then you find out it's not. It uncovers a lot of little threads, and then there's the, what about if you're the oldest sibling? What about if you're the youngest sibling? What about if you have another parent who has a disability? What if you have a single parent? So there's all sorts of variables that we're hoping to tease out as much as we can.
Was there any comment about the nature or quality of the services that they received?
Yes, yes. And we asked them about how much support and services they got in the clinic. So far, our hypothesis is that, the more services and resources you have leads to better outcomes. That hasn't quite panned out yet, but we're holding out. We're holding out.
You just asked them, the more services, did they get to rate the quality of the service?
No.
So I know you said you were still swimming in data, so I was just curious, do you have any data around maybe a sibling as well as a parent having a mental health?
We have a number of people, and we are taking a look at that. We have a number of twins. We have a number of siblings, because this is an 8-year study, so we are catching, and and it's fascinating. I've done a study. My first study as an anthropologist was on families like my own. I come from a deaf family. I wrote a book about growing up with deaf parents. I interviewed people all around the country, and I interviewed siblings. And I'm an only child, so it was amazing to me that when I talked to siblings, I would get 2 entirely different stories. I thought, how can this be? I thought they were gonna match perfectly. Now I understand. And so, while we're doing the same thing in this study, it's like we're kind of curious. So are they saying the same thing about their parent, and what are they saying, and how are they rating it? And again, of course, times change and age changes, but we are looking at that. So yeah.
Did you find any? I know you're still looking at the data, so most of it's still about the data. Did you find any difference in when they may have said that their parent may have had the onset of the condition?
Yes. What we're finding in general is that those students whose parent had the disability before they were born or shortly thereafter, those seem to have better outcomes than, the problem with that, than I would say than those later, but the problem is, right now it's a little conflated because we have a number of students whose parents, maybe when they were 7 or 8 or 9, were in a significant accident, suffered a traumatic brain injury, suffered a spinal cord injury. So the trauma of that accident, that impacted the whole family, maybe is still working its way out. So that is, we're sort of trying to separate that out of it.
So right now we're kind of cutting into the break time. We probably have time for 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Yes. And not surprisingly, we heard that far more from those whose parents had psychiatric disabilities. We heard a number of them talked about their own psychiatric mental illness. Some of them talked about suicidal ideation. Some of them talked about having tried suicide. We also, because we're a mental health organization, we feel the responsibility that if we read an essay that we feel there is some alarm bells that go off, we have one of our clinical staff contact the student in a, not in a, I'm so worried about you, but in a, I read your essay, we kind of try to talk to you to make sure that they are okay, that they have appropriate resources, perhaps at their school, just to make sure that they're okay. Because there are, this is only the tip of the iceberg, but there are some really, really hard stories to read. We have reviewers and researchers who both say, God, they just have to take a break.
Judge your positive results with the other things that we've been hearing, like 32% of children with families with severe mental illness have ended up with a serious problem, and 55%. I just vaguely remember those figures.
Yeah, well, again, I think you have to take in mind that, again, that's one of the limitations of the study is that these are students who are generally doing well. They're doing well in school. They're more involved in activities. So I think that's probably the quickest answer is that this is a group. What we did we tried to think of ways that we could expand the study to include students who were not in this group, who were not going on college, but we aren't there yet. And we do want to look at that. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.